Hello, this is week 3, video 1, and we'll be talking about knowledge and belief systems. So first, let's define knowledge and belief. For the purposes of this discussion, we can define them very simply as follows. Knowledge is information that is taken to be true based on fact, and belief is information that is taken to be true based on faith. Now notice that both definitions share the word taken to be true. So what we'll be emphasizing today is that whether we're talking about knowledge or belief, and how we define and categorize those, the people who actually have that knowledge or have those beliefs take them to be true to a large extent. So we're not going to be disputing whether or not people's beliefs are true or whether or not knowledge is true. We're going to be distinguishing the basis of that truth. So is the truth based on fact or is it based on faith? And we'll be talking about the importance of perspective in determining whether something is belief or knowledge. So let's take a look at sources of knowledge. If you have the Lasseter book and you're reading that, he goes into this in some detail. And if you'll notice, these sources of knowledge derive from the scientific method. So these will sound familiar to many of you in the sciences. So first of all, we have empiricism, the position that experience serves as the source of knowledge. Anthropology is a very empirical field. We look for empirical data in the field that we can show to our audience and say, I saw this, I experienced this. This is what the people on the ground experience. And that's how I know that this information is, again, something that we can take to be true. Okay, so empiricism, experience. The second is positivism, the position that knowledge is only useful if it can be proven. And so getting back to the scientific method, I mean, there are all kinds of ways of talking about proof. One of them is replicability. You know, can a chemistry experiment be performed again and again and again and again by different chemists and still produce the same results? Well, then that's a good example of positivism. We've proven that the knowledge we gain from that experiment is knowledge because we've proved it through replicability. And there are other ways that we can prove knowledge scientifically. Because I'm an anthropologist, I put everything in quotes. So, of course, proof is a word that we'll put in quotes, largely because of the discussion we're about to have about belief versus knowledge. Anyway, the final source is reason. So we want knowledge to be based on something that's factual, reasonable, and sound, something that we can use logic to kind of get through and make sense of. Okay, so the combination of these three in particular make us feel that what we're taking to be true is based on fact. We experience it, we prove it, it makes sense to us. Okay. And so even certain things that we can't experience, like, you know, I'll never be able to experience going to the moon. But there are other ways that I can use experience to sort of prove that to myself. I can read about people who have been to the moon. I can look in the sky and see the moon. I can think about other natural phenomena that I have experienced and how, you know, analogously, I can understand the fact that the moon exists. I mean, so this isn't, there are lots of ways that we can kind of apply these terms and come up with the conclusion that what we have is knowledge. Now, let's talk about perspectives. And anthropologists often talk about two perspectives, the emic and the eidetic. Emic refers to internal knowledge. It's understood from the point of view of insiders to a group or culture. This gets back to cultural relativity. Culture must be understood on its own terms, on the terms of the insiders to that culture, not from without. So anthropology tends to give primacy to the emic perspective. Okay, emic, internal. By contrast, the eidetic perspective reflects external knowledge that is imposed by outsiders, such as the anthropologist, on a system of beliefs and knowledge. Okay, so this is an example. We saw this example in NAUFT last week, where Knauft says, none of the Gabusi will tell you that they accuse people of sorcery in order to balance out an imbalance in the clan marriage system and sister exchange. But I can tell you, as the anthropologist, I have this external knowledge that makes me understand how this system works. Excuse me. So what I want to get you to think about is that belief from an edict perspective, an external perspective, seems to be just that, belief. So I'm having you read a couple of articles by E. Evans Pritchard and Nora Zeal Hurston about witchcraft and hoodoo beliefs among the Azande of Central Africa and African Americans in the rural South of the 1930s, respectively. And so as you think about these readings and what you've learned from them, think about this. Do the people described in those readings see what they understand to be truth as belief or knowledge? Okay, and this is an important distinction. So we often dismiss people's emic understandings as, oh, that's just belief. No one can prove that. They're taking that to be true based on faith. And we see it as a kind of a lower order. The higher order is knowledge that, especially coming from a society that's based, since the Enlightenment on some form of the scientific method that says, oh, you have to prove these things scientifically for you to be sure that you know them. But consider that from the emic perspective, what seems to us to be beliefs are actually knowledge that people have proven and reasoned through and experienced. Okay, so E. Evans Pritchard is a very famous anthropologist. He was knighted in Britain, his home country, for his major contributions to anthropology and to the British colonial enterprise. So he studied people that in countries that the British had colonized, so that the British could better administer the colonial agenda to those people. It's just that simple. But he also gave us a lot of information about several different groups of people in Africa that he studied, including the Nuer. Much of what you read in the article about the Nuer the other day was based on research by Evans Pritchard. And he wrote a couple of some major works. You don't have to know these, but just in case you're interested. Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande, from which the article I had you read is taken, the Nuer, and Theories of Primitive Religion. Again, primitive being an unfortunate word of the time that really refers... Oops. Sorry, I had a cat walking across my keyboard. Primitive being a word of its time and really referring to what we would call today small scale. And Evans Pritchard really got at, in his work, the difficulty, but not the impossibility of getting at the beliefs of a group of people as an outsider. So as you read his article, you might have been a little offended by some of his language choices, the way he referred to the Azande and the way he kind of presented them as children with these rather childlike beliefs. But something I'd like us to talk about on Wednesday is how that was in service of a larger goal, which was to convince his audience that actually the beliefs of the Azande make sense from within their own perspective. So we'll talk about that on Wednesday and be prepared to talk about that. So think about the Azande article and ask yourself, does their knowledge about witchcraft sort of pass the test of knowledge? How might the Azande be experiencing witchcraft and having it happen in a certain way again and again and again and again, to the point where certain events can only be explained as witchcraft? Second, how might the Azande express proof that these witchcraft beliefs exist as they believe them to exist? And finally, how do they reason through the system and make it make sense to themselves? So ask yourself this: if I look at what Evans Pritchard tells me about the Azande, can I see that emically what seem to me to be beliefs are actually, to the Azande, knowledge? Now, a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston. She was one of the students of Franz Boas. So, if you'll recall, one of his great contributions to the field of anthropology, especially at the time when he was practicing it, was admitting women and students of color to his anthropology program. And Zora Neale Hurston was one such student who went on to be highly influential as a novelist and folklorist. Now, Zora Neale Hurston has mostly been classified as a folklorist, and that is given a sort of lower value in academia to anthropologists because it's believed that anthropologists at that time were doing the more scientific stuff and folklorists were just kind of collecting stories. So one of the things I want us to talk about is the difference between Evans Pritchard, who's an anthropologist, and Zora Neale Hurston, who is sort of dismissed as a quote unquote mere folklorist, and why that might be. A couple of her most famous books are Mules and Men and Their Eyes Were Watching God, a novel. And even when she wrote a novel, it was an ethnographic novel that was very much trying to give a sense of the culture of a group of people. Hurston was also a great civil rights activist, but a controversial one, and she actually fell out of favor with a lot of Black civil rights leaders in much the same way that W.E.B. Du Bois did. There were, at certain points in American history, African American leaders were calling for accommodation. Basically, this is said very crudely, but let's try to prove ourselves as an African American community by looking as much like whites as we possibly can in terms of our lifestyle, our work ethic, our education levels. Like, let's prove ourselves by showing that we can be white too. And as you see from this reading by Hurston, she wrote in Black dialect. She presented this community as practicing hoodoo, which was a set of practices very much looked down by these Black civil rights, looked down on by these Black civil rights leaders. And by the end of her career, the end of her life, Hurston had really been sort of dismissed by much of the African American community as someone who was, in a sense, betraying them by giving these kinds of portrayals of the African American community. And there's been a real revival recently of her work and a renewed appreciation of it. So again, as you read about the hoodoo beliefs in Florida during the 1930s, ask yourself this. If you could talk to people in that community and ask, would you find that they believe hoodoo makes sense through these sources of knowledge, experience, proof, and reason? And we'll talk about that on Wednesday as well. Finally, on Wednesday, I wanted to compare and contrast Evans Pritchard and Hurston. Hurston is very much an emic writer. Evans Pritchard is an Edic writer. So we'll talk about those different perspectives and how each author uses that perspective. I want to talk about the tone of their writing, how they represent these groups of people to their audience. I want to look at the role of the anthropologist. They carry out very different kinds of field work, and I want to see what you think about the way Evans Pritchard does it versus Hurston's style. And then finally, we have big differences in their access to the group under study. So, for example, we can ask the question, could a white anthropologist have done the work that Hurston did in this community?